Welcome to the fabulous Fempreneurship podcast series for entrepreneurs with your host, Elaine Slatter. Each episode addresses topics to help you and your business grow and succeed. Join us as we interview a variety of global experts.
Hello, fabulous Fempreneur listeners. Today we have a very exciting podcast because we're going to be talking to Brenden from MasterTalk, and our subject is how to master the art of public speaking. And I don't know about our listeners, but I used to struggle with this big time. So welcome to our show, Brenden.
Thanks for having me on, Elaine. It's great to be on.
Great. Now, could you tell us a little bit about yourself for our listeners?
Of course, I'm happy to. So I make YouTube videos on public speaking, and the channel is called MasterTalk. And how I got started was, I remember I was 5 years old growing up in Montreal, and my parents came up to me and they said, well, Brenden, you went to a French city. I mean, you're in a French city, so you got to learn the language. So we're going to put you in a French school. Except one problem. I didn't speak a word of French. So not only was I uncomfortable with presentations my whole life, I had to give presentations in a language I didn't know. So my whole life, I was very passionate about this idea of communication and public speaking. And when I went to university, I did a lot of case competitions. For those who don't know, it's professional sports for nerds. So in the same way a lot of people my age would, play sports or do something else competitively, I did that in the realm of presentations. So I presented hundreds of times at university, loved every second of it. And after I graduated, I sort of asked myself this question, which is, how do I use my time and expertise to make an impact in the world? That's when the idea for the YouTube channel came to be.
Well, that's fantastic because that's a passion of yours. And now you have come out and helped so many different people. And among your clients has been the universities as well in your area, correct?
Absolutely.
So let's dig in here. And first question is, what is the biggest challenge with public speaking?
Of course. So the biggest challenge, Elaine, is most of us don't actually know how to practice public speaking. So let's say we take a new skill, whether it's piano, whether it's basketball, or even just, new recipe that we're trying out at our home. Even if all of these skills are fundamentally different, the underlying logic is the same. Do small things over and over again until it's perfect. And I'll use piano here as an example. When we started playing the piano the first time, sure, we can try 50 different songs, 50 different ways of doing something. Or we can sing the same song, play the same exact thing 50 times until it's perfect. And usually the second option is better, because if we can do it 50 times, we can show off to our friends that we know how to play piano, even if we only know one song. But we don't apply that analogy to public speaking. It's Wednesday, our boss, our client, our teacher comes up to us and says, Elaine, I need a presentation for Friday. So we get our act together. We worked really hard on our presentation. We spent a good 15, 20 hours building it. We present it, and then we crumble it, throw it in a garbage bin, and then work on another presentation. Whereas the best speakers in the world only have one or two presentations, but the secret is they present it hundreds of times.
So how do you present it hundreds of times, or even present it after you've rehearsed it so it doesn't sound rehearsed? Because that's a problem I have for sure.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of ways of going about this. So one is that this type of practice only works with what we call repeatable presentations. So a lot of questions I get is pertaining to work. They go, oh, Brenden, I work a 9 to 5 at a bank. What's repeatable about that? So my advice to people is to find something outside of work that you can do multiple times. So let's say we take Julia, who's working at a bank and, doesn't really present anything super interesting at work. So what I would tell Julia is I would ask her the following question. What do you do outside of work? And she might answer with things like this. I'm a huge marathon runner. I run a lot and I get gold medals in marathons, something I love. Or maybe she takes care of her kids. Maybe there's recipes she likes to make at home. It doesn't really matter what the passion is, something that interests her. So what I would tell Julie is I would say that you just gave me 3 presentations that really light you up, that really drive your passion. And then she gets confused and says, Brenden, what do you mean? I just talked about marathoning and things like that. Well, I would reply with, the 3 presentations that you've given us today, Julia, are the following. Marathons and how they changed your life and how it's transformed the way that you live. 2, tips on parenting, how you grew up, how you raised your kids so that people like me can learn from you. And 3, maybe there's a recipe that you tried out that's really cool, that you really enjoy, that you want to share with other people. So what happens in these types of presentations that's very different than what we're used to is when we present that to 2 to 3 people, if one of those people come back to us and says, Julia, hey, you really inspired me to go for a run. I just ran this morning. Julia is going to get excited because she's going to see the impact of her presentation, is going to want to present it to 10 people, to 100 people, and then she's going to be on her way.
Okay, so we should start practicing your saying on something that we love that isn't necessarily something that we do for a living.
Absolutely. And how that ties back to the second part of your question, which is how do we still keep presenting it without making it seem robotic? Well, what generally happens when you're doing something you actually care about is you're not asking yourself these questions, which we usually do when public speaking is a chore, which is, oh, how do I get each of my words correctly? How do I get all my syllables? How do I get my slides right? But we're asking brand new questions. And those questions could be, what kind of emotions am I conveying in this slide? What am I trying to achieve with this presentation? How can I best change the way that I speak in a way that's more compelling for my audience? And if you use me as an example, Elaine, I've probably presented my keynote now over 300 times. Not 3 times, not 30 times, but 300 times. So how do I keep it interesting? The way that I keep it interesting is by refining the craft, by making it so good that even if I'm listening to this thing over and over again, the audience who's listening to me, it's their first time listening to it. So it blows their mind because of the level of practice and the rigor of the questions that I'm asking myself, whether it's vocal tonality, whether it's the way that I'm changing my emotions in a presentation. It's just we don't ask those questions when we're working on 300 different presentations.
Okay, so if you're giving your keynote, what do you practice then? When you're practicing it, what are you practicing?
Yeah, of course. So let's start with the basics. Right? How do we structure a keynote in a way that gets people excited to hear what you have to offer and what ideas you want to share? So it starts with the following question. Let's say it's our last presentation ever. And after you present, you'll never get to present for the rest of your life. And in that, it's a good way to start. It gets people
Yeah.
clear really fast. And in that presentation, no one's going to remember your name. No one's going to remember your title. And frankly, no one's going to remember what you say too. But your audience will remember one sentence. What do you want the sentence to be? And from that, this is what we call the key idea, or I guess the essential idea, the thing that actually matters from what you have to share with people. And then the next question is a simple one. What do you believe is the best way to convey and defend that key idea? So if you use me as an example, sure, I talk a lot about public speaking. You have a bunch of videos and a bunch of tips. But at the end of the day, if there was one sentence that summarizes all of my work, it would be the following. I believe fundamentally that public speaking and leadership is taught in the same way. That's all. We believe that leaders are created, not born. We know that, but we don't believe that with public speaking. We tend to think that public speaking is you're born with this thing, and I'm here to change that cultural paradigm. So all of my keynotes defend that, and the best way that I defend that thesis is by talking about my own vulnerabilities as a speaker. I was a kid. I spent 15 years of my life presenting in a language I didn't know. So if I can master public speaking, I'm sure everyone who's listening to me right now can do it too. So that's a good way of starting the conversation.
Yeah, that's right, because it gets their attention because they're not professional public speakers. And now you've told a story that they can relate to.
You got it. And the point I want to drive here is it doesn't necessarily need to be a story either. It just needs to be something that clearly defends what you want to share. So let's say in my case, the reason why the personal story works is because it relates to people. If I talk about my own vulnerabilities as a speaker, the woman who's sitting there, the teenage girl sitting there, the person who's in the room will relate to their own fear and see themselves or see me in themselves, right? So that's where the relationship comes. But on the other hand, if I said a quote or I said an analogy, for example, I like comparing the way that we speak to people who are rushing on Boxing Day or Black Friday to get gifts. They're going so fast and to get out so quickly, and that's the same way in how we speak because we're always speaking so quickly. So I like to use analogies as well. So it's always about you asking yourself, what is the best thing that works for you? Is it an analogy? Is it a quote? And by tying in with what you're comfortable with, you can explain it in the best possible way that works for you.
So why do we struggle so much with public speaking?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way that I want us to think about this, because it's always been bizarre when I thought about it, why are we all so afraid of it? There's so many of us that are scared of public speaking, but we don't necessarily understand why. So let's understand that a bit more by asking ourselves a simple question, which is, where have we given most of our presentations? And the answer is school. We don't wake up one morning and say, hey, Elaine, you want to get breakfast and present all day? Nobody says that. Nobody does that. What generally happens is we're in high school. We're in high school together. And then the teacher comes up to us and says, Elaine, Brenden, I need you to do this presentation on the Renaissance. And you think it's a fruit, but it ends up being a time period in history. And then when you present, you realize that nobody cares about your presentation. Why? One, because you don't get to pick the topic, and it's generally something you're not passionate about. Two, the students who are listening to you don't care. Not because they don't care about you. They probably like you as an individual. But the issue is that they're worried about their own presentation because they got to go in 10 minutes. So they're not focused on you. They're focused on themselves in their presentation, which is normal. And three, the teacher, who's generally very well-intentioned, very smart and educated, is super stressed. They got 30 presentations to go through, and they don't have time to sit you down and say, hey, Elaine, let's spend 10 minutes and talk about your presentation. So when we have topics we don't get to pick, to students who don't care to hear us, to teachers who are really stressed to listen to us and give us advice, this behavior doesn't just perpetuate in history. It perpetuates in every subject that we give. English, French, languages, science, math, music, gym, on and on and on. We're led to believe that public speaking is a chore. It's an obligation. It's a responsibility instead of what public speaking actually is meant for, which is this very conversation, as a way to communicate impact, as a way to share our ideas in something that we care about. And once we're able to shift our mindset from the chore, from the responsibility, some of the thing we don't want to do, to the impact that we can create, that's when public speaking becomes a lot more interesting.
I loved your story there because it's true. If we focus on the impact of what we're saying rather than, as you mentioned, the chore of actually having to go through it, it shifts your focus too on how you can present.
Completely agreed.
Yeah, because you know, as you mentioned, you've got that one nugget that you're trying to get across. So if you focus on the impact of that one thought or one sentence that you want to leave them with, it can totally reframe your whole presentation.
Exactly. And once you reframe that yourself, in the message you're communicating, it gives you a whole new energy and a whole new intention in how you're approaching it. Because it changes really quickly from, oh no, I have this presentation in 10 minutes. What am I going to do? To, I have the privilege and honor to share something really important for people who probably care about what I have to say. So let me share it in the best possible way.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember in my undergraduate, my wish was to get through my degree without having to present to the class. And I almost got through it, but then one semester we had to present. And I have to say that was my biggest fear. But then with the help of a few people, I got over that and realized that once I'd done it once, it's not such a bad thing after all.
Absolutely.
So what advice would you give people that are invited, say, onto a panel where they're asked to give their opinion or an interview where it's going to be on TV and so on, and they have no idea what the questions are going to be. How can people like that present themselves well in public speaking? Because it's still public speaking if you're being interviewed on a TV show.
No, absolutely. So there's two pieces of advice that I can give to people. So one is for getting out of the comfort zone that we're in to help us expand new ways of speaking, especially if it's something, we're not prepared for, we don't know what questions are coming. And the second part of it is what I call bulletproofing your speech and bulletproofing your interviews. So let's start with the bulletproofing because it's way easier for people to implement tomorrow. The best way to answer questions that you don't know or not sure what you're going to get is to answer all of them up front. So what I do, and this is what I did when I started podcasting myself, was I would get a group of people that were really harsh and I made them ask me a bunch of questions for a couple of hours. So once people ask you hundreds of questions about your life, your story, the topic, and what you're supposed to be saying, there isn't a single question you can't answer anymore. So you can imagine, Elaine, when I started MasterTalk, I was fairly young. I didn't know that much about public speaking. I didn't have a PhD in communication. But once you present 500 times, you give a bunch of keynotes, at some point you come to you enter this realm where there's not really a question you can't answer, right? Because you just know so much about your own subject. So I hope that serves as a way to help people. So one practical tip is get a bunch of people on a Zoom call, force them all to ask you 50 questions, and get stressed in that moment, figure out answers on the spot so that when you're actually ready for the interview, you'll do a fantastic job because there isn't a question that you won't be able to answer. That's one part of it. The second part is what I call the random word exercise. So we'll demonstrate this. Elaine, why don't you just give me a random word?
Communication.
Okay, that's great. So what I need to do, you gave me an easy one, you let me off easy. So what I need to do with communication is I need to create a presentation surrounding that word out of thin air. So here I go. A lot of us tend to believe that writing is important, that knowing how to do our finances are important, that knowing how to cook for ourselves is important. And all of these skills are essential to our life. But if there's any skill that is more important than any other, it would be communication. Why? Because communication isn't just about presentation. It's a way of being. It's the conversations that we have with the shopkeeper at our local town. It's the laughs that we share with the people that we care about. And it's to the questions that we ask a potential date when it's the first time we're nervous and we don't know what to say. Communication isn't just something that we do. It's the very thing that we are. And by enabling and being more open to that, we'll be able to share our ideas and what we care about to the world. So notice how I just invented out of thin air, but obviously you gave me an easy time, you gave me an easy word. But the way that this applies to people is every day for 5 minutes, what I want to challenge everyone listening to do is to pick 5 random words. Could be like teapot or laundry, or have your partner or your family or your friends give you 5 words, and do 5 words, 5 minutes every day, and you'll slowly live in that discomfort. Because at some point you'll get spaghetti and you won't know what to do with it. But then after, when you get to a TV interview and a host is asking you something that you already know and have spent years perfecting, suddenly that doesn't seem too hard anymore.
Yes, and one thing I found when I'm coaching some of my clients is you know your subject matter way better than the interviewer and the listeners. So you have to have the confidence in your own abilities. And if you have that confidence, as you said, somebody could fire you 200 questions in your area of expertise, and you probably wouldn't have any problem answering any of those 200 questions because you're actually living that every single day that you're working in that area. So I think sometimes your fear of the unknown is really shouldn't be a fear at all because you're, after all, the expert. So really, most interviewers and most listeners would not even know if you were afraid to speak because you know your topic so well that you can answer all those questions without hesitation because you are the expert.
Absolutely. And one way of kind of adding some reassurance to the people out there is, yes, you're right. Sometimes you can't control the question, but you always have control over the answer. At the end of the day, when somebody asks you a question, sure, you can't control that. You don't know what question they're going to ask you, but you control what you want to say to people. You're the game master. You're the person who's taking the lead, and you're the person who controls the outcome. So if you answer something that isn't exactly what you wanted to say, what is the reporter going to do? Follow up and say, Elaine, well, I actually researched you. This is not true. No, we're just going to move on to the next question. You're the subject matter expert.
Yes, that's a good way of framing it, Brenden, because that's absolutely right. The interviewer doesn't know exactly all the details. They can't possibly know. And if you've missed something, who cares? You know what I mean? I mean, you've given the general answer to the interviewer's question. And as you mentioned, they're not going to sort of pinpoint every single item you said and said, okay, you've given me 5, but I know from my research that there are 6 and you missed one. That nobody does that.
Yeah, and they don't do that for a reason, because they want you to come back. They
Yeah.
invited you for a reason. Why would they want to give you a hard time?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I think sometimes our fears of why we don't accept keynotes and why we don't accept interviews on TV and all that kind of thing is our own personal fear. It's got nothing to do with being an expert on the subject or not being an expert. It's more our own nervousness and our own fears. I know that was it for me in university. It was my own personal fear that I had made up to be enormous. It became an elephant and it should have been an ant.
That's a great analogy and a great way of thinking about it, Elaine. And I completely agree. If you have something important to share with people, I encourage you all to share it. And another way I can explain this is, it's like sports athletes at a conference. Whether it's women's soccer, whether it's a male rugby team. Notice how the athletes who sit in that conference room don't really care what the reporters ask them, because they know that those reporters don't have the best intentions in that room. They're just trying to ask them bullet, and that doesn't happen in the interviews you're going to be doing in your case. But because they are famous, that's what. But notice how when they answer, they just answer however they want, because they know that reporter isn't allowed to ask a follow-up question because there's 15 other people who want to ask questions. So remember, you always have control over the answer. That should be empowering, not disempowering.
Yes, yes. So why do you think we struggle so much with public speaking?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely going back to the history analogy in high school, that's definitely one of the main reasons, is because we don't understand where the fear of public speaking comes from. But now that we know that it's not our fault, that it's, the system that we grew up to believe, the next thing that we need to do is, once we change that belief system, and one easy way of doing this through a simple question, Elaine, is the following: how would the world change if you are an exceptional communicator? And if that world is just you getting a promotion, no wonder you're scared of public speaking, because you're always focused on an outcome and a result that you selfishly want, which I'm sure isn't the case in this call and the people who are listening. But what I am saying is, what if the answer to the question was the following? Oh, well, there's this guy I was talking to the other day, and I asked him, why is communication important to you? And he responded with, oh, I want to get a visa in Canada. I want to know how to speak English. I want to know how to articulate properly. Then I would say, okay, that's great. That's great. But like, what happens after that? And then he said, well, I get to travel. And I would say, okay, keep going. And then he said the key question, the key thing I was looking for, which was, well, my wife doesn't speak English or doesn't know how to communicate properly. So if I can do it, I can bring her on all these trips and show her a great time that, and really make her life better, because I love her very much. That's the reason I'm getting to. That's the world I'm trying to get to. And think about me. Why would you listen to a public speaking coach who doesn't know how to speak? Right? We all have a reason for why we want to master communication. If you can tap into that reason for being, that reason for sharing a message that matters, it'll be much easier for you to focus on getting it done. Trust me.
Yeah, you're right. If we focus too much on the outcome, then we won't have the impact because we're not concentrating on that one nugget, as you mentioned, that we need to get across to the audience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's been so helpful, Brenden. And I understand you have a weekly video on YouTube, and it's tips on how to master public speaking, correct?
You got it. So for those who are interested in asking me a question or a concern or even just insults are totally fine. Feel free to message me on Instagram at Master Your Talk. And if you want to check out the YouTube videos and learn from the best speaking tips that I have, you can check out the YouTube channel, which is MasterTalk in one word.
That's great. So I encourage everybody that's listening, if you have a problem with public speaking, and I would say that, most people do, they just don't have the confidence. Your tips, your weekly tips would be so fantastic for the listeners. They need to, follow you and subscribe to your channel, because when I went on your channel, it was fantastic. You pick up these tips, and there's no reason why anybody can't be confident public speaking if they follow you, Brenden. I really believe that.
I really appreciate you saying that, Elaine. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for being such a great guest. And we'll have in the show notes links to Brenden's YouTube channel and to his Instagram and to your website. And that way, if anybody wants to get in touch with you for personal coaching, they can do that, I assume?
Absolutely.
Oh, perfect. That's great. So thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate that.
Of course, Elaine. Thanks for creating this space for everyone around you as well.
Thank you. And it's great to talk, and we'll talk again soon.
Of course. Thank you so much.
To receive your free gift and connect directly with the podcast guest, visit our website at fabfempreneurship.com/entrepreneur mastermind podcasts and click on this episode. Here's to building your business growth, one step at a time. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not tune into other episodes in this series at fabfempreneurship.com/entrepreneur mastermind podcasts.